The Vatican's secret archives hold 53 miles of shelving. They contain the personal letters of popes, kings, and conquerors. But the one object that could validate the entire Christian faith, the cup used by Jesus Christ at the Last Supper, is nowhere to be found. Or so they say. What if the most sought-after relic in human history isn't lost? What if it's been hidden in plain sight for centuries, protected by a secret so profound, so earth-shattering, that its discovery could unravel 2,000 years of history? This isn't just a story about a cup. It's about the secret it protects. Forget everything you think you know. Forget the jewel-encrusted chalice from Hollywood. Forget the knights in shining armor and the miraculous healing powers. The popular image of the Holy Grail is a lie, a carefully constructed fantasy designed to distract from a much more dangerous truth. The earliest accounts never describe a golden cup. They describe something far more humble, something you could easily overlook. And that was the point. The real power of the Grail was never about granting eternal life. It was about knowledge, a piece of information so explosive that the most powerful organizations in history, from the Knights Templar to the Nazi SS, have waged a secret war across centuries to possess it. They weren't just treasure hunting. They were trying to control the past to dominate the future. And it all goes back to one room, one night, and one question: what really happened at the Last Supper? The search for the Holy Grail is the ultimate detective story. It's a labyrinth of forged documents, secret societies, and cryptic codes, a trail of breadcrumbs left by poets, mystics, and heretics. And to follow it, we have to go back to a time before the legend even existed. Because here's the first shocking truth. The Holy Grail is not in the Bible. Not a single gospel. Not Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John mentions a special cup from the Last Supper being preserved. The disciples weren't relic hunters. They were terrified men on the run, convinced their leader was about to be executed. The idea of one of them grabbing the dinnerware on the way out is frankly absurd. So if the story didn't come from the Bible, where did it come from? The answer lies not in the deserts of Judea, but in the misty forests of medieval Europe. The Grail legend as we know it was born from the mind of a single man, a French poet named Chrétien de Troyes. Around the year 1180, he began writing a story, a chivalric romance called Perceval, the story of the Grail. It was a work of fiction. In his tale, a young naive knight named Perceval visits the castle of the Fisher King, a monarch suffering from a mysterious wound that has laid his kingdom to waste. During a feast, Perceval witnesses a strange procession. A bleeding lance passes by, followed by a young woman carrying an ornate, glowing vessel called a Graal. Perceval, having been taught it was rude to ask too many questions, stays silent. He later learns that if he had just asked, "Whom does one serve with the Grail?" the king would have been healed and the land restored. Chrétien de Troyes died before he could finish the story, leaving the mystery unsolved. He never even called it the Holy Grail. He never connected it to Jesus Christ. It was just a grail, a platter or a bowl. But he had lit a fire. His unfinished poem became one of the first bestsellers of the Middle Ages. Other writers, seeing its popularity, rushed to write their own sequels and prequels. They were the ones who began to weave in Christian theology. A German poet named Wolfram von Eschenbach reimagined the Grail not as a cup, but as a stone that fell from heaven, guarded by a neutral host of angels who refused to take sides in the war between God and Lucifer. But it was another writer, Robert de Boron, who made the connection that would change history forever. Around the year 1200, he wrote a poem explicitly identifying the Grail as the cup of the Last Supper, and added another crucial element, that it was later used by Joseph of Arimathea to catch Christ's blood at the crucifixion. Suddenly, a fantasy object from a French poem had become the most sacred relic in Christendom. The legend had been born. But this process of Christianizing the Grail was actually masking a much older, deeper tradition. Before Chrétien de Troyes ever put pen to paper, European folklore was filled with stories of magical vessels. Celtic myths, in particular, are rich with tales of cauldrons that could resurrect dead warriors, or provide an endless supply of food. The Dagda, a father god of Irish mythology, possessed a cauldron from which no company ever went away hungry. The Welsh hero Bran the Blessed had a cauldron of rebirth. These weren't just dinner pots. They were powerful symbols of life, regeneration, and esoteric knowledge, often guarded in a mystical otherworld. What the medieval poets did was take this potent, pre-existing pagan symbol and give it a Christian facelift. They swapped the Celtic otherworld for a hidden castle, the magical cauldron for a sacred chalice, and the Celtic hero for a Christian knight. It was a brilliant act of cultural appropriation, a way of absorbing the old magic into the new faith. This is the secret origin of the Grail, not a historical artifact from Jerusalem, but a mythological archetype that has haunted the European imagination for millennia. But this raises an even more profound question. If the story is pure fiction, a blend of Celtic myth and Christian poetry, why have so many intelligent, powerful, and ruthless people dedicated their lives and ended the lives of others to find it? Because buried within the fiction, there is a kernel of truth. The legend they believed was a map, a coded message pointing to something real. And over the centuries, dozens of objects have been put forward as that one true cup. Most are easily dismissed as medieval forgeries, created to fleece gullible pilgrims. But a few are different. A few have pedigrees so old, so compelling, and so mysterious that they defy easy explanation. They are the prime candidates in our investigation. Our search begins in Spain in a quiet, ornate chapel in the city of Valencia. There, encased in a lavish gold and jewel-studded reliquary, sits a simple, unassuming cup. It's small, carved from a single piece of dark red agate. It is humble, ancient, and according to a chain of evidence stretching back over 1700 years, it is the cup that Jesus held in his hands as he spoke the words, "This is my blood." This is the Santo Chalice, the Holy Chalice of Valencia. Church tradition claims this cup was taken from Jerusalem to Rome by St. Peter himself, where it was used by the early popes for centuries. When the Roman Emperor Valerian began persecuting Christians in the 3rd century, the Pope entrusted the cup to his deacon, St. Lawrence, who smuggled it to his homeland in Spain for safekeeping. From there, the story becomes a desperate chase through history. The cup was hidden from invading Moorish armies, passed from monastery to monastery, and guarded by kings. Its journey is a saga of faith, war, and survival. Archaeological analysis confirms the cup itself is a Middle Eastern artifact dating from between the 4th century BC and the 1st century AD, making its presence at the Last Supper chronologically possible. Unlike the fantastical stories of the poets, the history of the Valencia chalice is grounded in names, dates, and documented transfers. It is, by far, the most credentialed and historically plausible candidate for the Holy Grail on Earth. But if this is the true cup, the most powerful object in the world, why isn't it the most famous? And what of the other contenders, like the cup supposedly found by the Templars, or the one that ended up in a remote Welsh mansion? The story of the Valencia chalice is incredible, but it's only the first piece of a puzzle that is far larger and far stranger than you can possibly imagine. Because as we'll soon discover, finding the cup is only the beginning of the mystery. The real secret is what it was used for. To understand that, we have to go back to the foot of the cross moments after the Last Supper. Because the legend of the Grail isn't about one single event but two. The first was the meal, where a simple cup became a vessel of communion. But the second was an act of profound devotion and staggering risk, performed by a man who has been all but erased from the mainstream story. His name was Joseph of Arimathea. The Gospels describe him as a wealthy man, a respected member of the Sanhedrin, the very council that condemned Jesus. But secretly, he was a disciple. He moved in the shadows, his faith a dangerous secret in a city on a knife's edge. When Jesus died while the other disciples were scattered in fear, it was Joseph who stepped out of the darkness. He went directly to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and did something unthinkable. He asked for the body of Jesus. This was an act of incredible bravery. The Romans typically left the crucified to rot on their crosses as a warning to others. But Joseph, using his wealth and influence, secured the body for a proper burial in his own and used tomb. This is where the story ends, and the legend of the Grail truly begins. Because according to ancient, non-biblical texts, Joseph did more than just provide a tomb. At the crucifixion, as a Roman soldier pierced Christ's side with a spear, Joseph was there. And in his hands he held a cup. Some legends say it was the very same cup from the Last Supper. Others say it was a different vessel entirely. But into that cup, he caught the blood and water that flowed from the wound. Think about what this means. The Grail suddenly becomes two things at once. It is the cup of the covenant, used to seal a new promise with humanity, but it is also the vessel of the blood, a container holding the most sacred substance imaginable. the literal physical life force of God on earth. This single object now holds the twin mysteries of life and death, of sacrament and sacrifice. It is no longer just a cup. It is a concentration of divine power unlike anything the world has ever known. And Joseph of Arimathea was its first guardian. But this holy act made him a target. The authorities, enraged that Jesus' body was missing from the tomb, arrested Joseph and threw him into a lightless prison, leaving him to starve. For decades he was trapped. But the story says he was not alone. In the darkness of his cell, the resurrected Christ appeared to him, holding the Grail, now glowing with an otherworldly light. He handed the cup to Joseph and initiated him into its deepest secrets, mysteries of faith, creation, and the divine that were too powerful for the public world. The cup, which had miraculously provided Joseph with nourishment during his long imprisonment, was now entrusted to his care. His mission was no longer just to protect it, but to carry it to a new safe home, far from the collapsing world of the Roman Empire. When he was finally released, an old man who had survived the impossible, Joseph gathered a small band of followers. He did not travel east, toward the established centers of power. He turned west. He and his followers became wanderers, guardians of a secret, carrying their sacred relic across the known world. They crossed the treacherous seas of the Mediterranean, passed through the Pillars of Hercules, and sailed north into the cold, misty waters of the Atlantic, toward the farthest edge of the Roman Empire, a mysterious fog-shrouded island the Romans called Britannia. Why there? Why this remote, half-wild island of warring Celtic tribes? The legend suggests it was a place of immense spiritual power, a land where the veil between worlds was thin, a place where the old magic of the earth could nurture this new, potent faith. After a long and perilous journey, they are said to have landed on the coast of what is now Somerset, England. They carried the Grail inland until they reached a strange, conical hill rising from a vast wetland, an island in a sea of reeds. The locals called it the Isle of Avalon. Today we call it Glastonbury Tor. It was here, exhausted from his journey, that Joseph of Arimathea is said to have planted his staff into the ground on a hill. And the next morning the dry wooden staff had miraculously sprouted leaves and blossomed. This became the Glastonbury thorn, a tree that blooms twice a year, once in spring and again at Christmas, a living symbol of the Grail's life-giving power, a tree that grew in England for nearly 2,000 years until it was tragically cut down in 2010. On that spot, Joseph and his followers are said to have built a small, simple church of wattle and daub, the very first Christian church in all of Britain, a full century before the official missionaries from Rome ever arrived. This wasn't just a man bringing a relic. This was the founding of a new secret branch of Christianity, one rooted not in the politics of Rome, but in the mystical power of the Grail itself. Glastonbury became its hidden sanctuary. The Grail was safe, for a time. But what happened next is perhaps the most frustrating and compelling part of the entire mystery. After the death of Joseph and his original companions, the story simply fades. The historical record goes silent. For hundreds of years, as the Roman Empire crumbled, as waves of Anglo-Saxon invaders crashed upon the shores of Britain, the Grail vanishes from history. It enters a long, dark sleep. It was not forgotten. The knowledge of its existence was passed down, a secret whispered through a lineage of guardians, a sacred trust kept alive in the shadows. They protected it, waiting for a time when the world would be ready for its return. They knew that a cup that could grant eternal life, heal any wound, and reveal the secrets of God was too powerful to be left in the open. In the wrong hands, it would be a weapon. In a world of chaos and war, it would be a catalyst for endless bloodshed. And so it remained hidden, a sleeping legend buried in the heart of Britain. It became a memory, a myth, a half-remembered story told by the fire on a cold winter's night. A story of a sacred cup, a thorn tree that bloomed in the snow, and a promise of a future king who would be worthy of finding it. The stage was being set for a new chapter in the Grail's history. The age of the Guardians was ending. The age of the Questers was about to begin. The world needed a hero, a fellowship of the best and bravest knights the world had ever known, to prove themselves worthy of even looking upon it. But before they could begin their search, they first needed a king whose rise was foretold in magic and war, and whose destiny was inextricably linked to the sacred vessel sleeping beneath the green hills of Avalon. The land bled. With the death of the great king, Uther Pendragon, Britain was a body without a head. A power vacuum had opened, and into it rushed the very worst of men. Petty warlords and ambitious barons carved up the kingdom, their private armies clashing in the fields and burning the villages. The dream of a unified Logres, a civilized Britain, was dying in a torrent of blood and fire. Law was forgotten. Chivalry was a madman's dream. For years the people suffered under the boot of chaos, praying for a savior, for the rightful heir to deliver them. But Uther had died without a known successor, his only son supposedly lost to the mists of time. It was in this age of despair that a figure of immense power stepped from the shadows. Merlin. He was more than a man. He was a bridge between the old world of magic and the new world of men. He saw the nation tearing itself apart and knew that only a king of destiny, a leader chosen not by the bloody Game of Thrones but by a higher power, could stitch it back together. He traveled to London, to the greatest church in the city, and on Christmas morning, as the people gathered to pray for deliverance, a miracle occurred. In the churchyard, where none had been before, stood a great square stone like a crude altar, and thrust deep into its center was a magnificent sword, its hilt encrusted with jewels that glittered in the pale winter sun. Etched into the stone in letters of gold was a message, a divine challenge for all to see. Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is rightwise king born of all England. The news spread like wildfire. Hope, a long extinguished ember, was fanned back into a flame. The lords and knights, the powerful and the proud, flocked to London. Each saw himself as the chosen one, the man destined to rule. They came in their shining armor, their banners snapping in the wind, each one certain of his strength. One by one, they laid their hands on the hilt. They heaved, they strained, they pulled with all the might that had won them battles and forged them kingdoms. And one by one they failed. The sword did not budge. It was as if it were part of the stone itself, fused by magic and time. The stone mocked their ambition, a silent testament to the fact that brute force was not what the kingdom needed. It needed something more. Frustrated and humbled, the barons declared a great tournament to be held on New Year's Day. Perhaps, they reasoned, a display of knightly prowess would prove a man's worthiness and coax the sword from its prison. And so the greatest warriors in the land gathered to compete. Among them was a noble knight, Sir Ector, and his two sons. The first was his own blood, Sir Kay, a newly minted knight, proud and eager to prove his valor. The second was Kay's younger brother, a boy of 16 they called Arthur, who served as Kay's squire. Arthur was a good lad but unremarkable. He possessed no great title, no famous name. His world was one of polishing armor, mending tackle, and tending to the horses. As they rode to the tournament grounds, Sir Kay realized with a jolt of frustration that he had left his sword back at their lodgings. Impatient and angry at his own forgetfulness, he ordered Arthur to ride back and fetch it at once. Arthur, ever dutiful, turned his horse and galloped back through the city streets. But when he arrived, the inn was locked and empty. Everyone had gone to see the tournament. Desperate not to fail his brother, Arthur worried what to do. He couldn't return empty-handed. It was then that he remembered. He remembered passing the churchyard, and the great stone with the sword embedded in it. In his youthful innocence, he saw not an instrument of prophecy, but simply a sword sitting there for the taking. It would be a fine replacement for Kay's. I will ride to the churchyard, he thought, and take the sword that sticketh in the stone, for my brother must have a sword. He rode to the quiet square, now deserted. He saw no golden letters, no sign of the divine. He saw only a solution to his problem. Dismounting, he walked to the anvil, took the handle in both hands, and gave a firm, steady pull. It slid free. The blade came out of the stone as smoothly as if it were being drawn from a scabbard of water. He felt no great surge of power, heard no chorus of angels. He just held a beautiful sword in his hand, marveled at it for a moment, and then, completely unaware of the magnitude of his act, he rode off to find his brother. When he presented the sword to Kay, his brother recognized it instantly. The ambition that had failed so many other knights now flared in Kay's heart. He took the sword, found his father, Sir Ector, and declared, "Sir, lo, here is the sword of the stone, wherefore I must be king of this land." But Sir Ector was a wise and honorable man. He looked at his son, then at the fabled blade, and knew Kay was not telling the whole truth. He took his sons back to the churchyard and made Kay swear an oath on the Bible as to how he came by the sword. Kay, his face flushed with shame, confessed that Arthur had brought it to him. Sir Ector's gaze then fell upon Arthur, and for the first time, he looked at the boy not as a son, but as something else entirely, as his king. He knelt before the astonished boy. "Now I understand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You must be king." Word of what happened spread through the tournament grounds. The lords and barons were incredulous. Then they were furious. That this boy, this no-name squire, should be their king? It was an insult. Trick. They refused to believe it. They forced Arthur to return the sword to the stone, which he did with ease. Then they tried once more to pull it out. Each man, from the mightiest duke to the strongest knight, put his hand to the hilt and pulled until the veins stood out on his neck. And again they all failed. Then Arthur, the boy, stepped forward once more. And once more he drew the sword effortlessly. Still they would not yield. Pride is a more stubborn fortress than any castle. They demanded delay after delay, trial after trial. At Pentecost and again at Candlemas they held contests, and each time the result was the same. The strongest men in the kingdom were powerless before the stone, while the boy Arthur could draw and sheathe the mystic blade at will. A faction grew around the boy, commoners and lesser knights who were tired of the barons' endless wars. They saw the miracle for what it was, a sign from God. Finally, the people had enough. They cried out with one voice that Arthur was their rightful king, and that they would have no other. They proclaimed that any man who denied the will of God was a traitor to the realm. And so Arthur was crowned, but his throne was far from secure. The powerful lords who had been denied the sword now denied the king, forming a rebel alliance against him. The kingdom was still divided, still on the brink of war. It was then that Merlin appeared before the entire court. He silenced the dissent with a story that had been kept secret for 16 years. He revealed that Arthur was no common boy. He was the true-born son of Uther Pendragon and his queen Igraine. Merlin explained how he had spirited the infant prince away on the night of his birth to protect him from Uther's enemies, and placed him in the care of the loyal Sir Ector. The sword in the stone was not a random selection. It was a test designed to reveal the one true heir. This revelation solidified Arthur's claim, but it was his character that would truly win the kingdom. In the battles that followed, he proved himself a brilliant strategist and a peerless warrior. But more than that, he showed mercy to his vanquished enemies and wisdom beyond his years. He forged a new order, an idea that would become a legend in its own right. A fellowship of the best knights in the world, all equal, bound by an oath of chivalry. He would build a shining castle, a beacon of hope in a dark world, and call it Camelot. He would create the Round Table, where no man sat at the head, a symbol of unity and justice. With the land finally at peace and the kingdom united under one virtuous king, Merlin knew the time was coming. The stage was set. The establishment of Camelot and the Round Table was not the end goal. It was the beginning. It was the forging of a vessel, a brotherhood of souls pure enough and strong enough to undertake the greatest and most perilous quest in human history. The kingdom had its king. Now the king and his knights would be given their true purpose, to heal the land not just with swords and laws but with spirit, to seek out the ultimate holy relic, the cup of the Last Supper, the Holy Grail. The quest began not with a map, but with a miracle. Imagine Camelot at its zenith. The Round Table, a perfect circle of the world's greatest warriors, united under one king. They are celebrating the Feast of Pentecost, a day of holy significance. The great hall is filled with the sounds of victory and camaraderie. But then a sudden deafening crack of thunder rolls through the castle, not from the sky, but from within the very stones of the hall. The knights grip their swords. The ladies gasp. The room falls silent. A sunbeam, brighter than any they have ever seen, lances through a window, illuminating the hall with a divine, otherworldly light. And floating in that beam, covered by a cloth of shimmering white samite, is a vessel. No one can see its shape clearly, but they don't need to. They feel its presence. A wave of profound peace and grace washes over every soul in the room. The air becomes thick with the scent of spices and celestial perfumes. Every knight feels his heart swell, his spirit lifted. This is a presence beyond earthly comprehension. This is the Holy Grail. It passes through the hall, a silent, holy procession of one, and then vanishes as mysteriously as it appeared. For a moment there is only stunned silence. The knights stare at the empty space where it had been, their minds reeling. They have been given a glimpse of heaven, a taste of the divine, and it has left them wanting more. It is Sir Gawain, bold and ever impetuous, who leaps to his feet first. He swears an oath, right then and there, to ride for a year and a day, to not return to court until he has looked upon the Holy Grail, unveiled and in all its glory. One by one, the other knights rise, their voices joining his. 150 of the world's finest warriors, pledging themselves to this sacred mission. King Arthur's heart is heavy. He sees the look in their eyes, this feverish holy ambition. He knows this is not a quest for treasure or for land. It is a spiritual crucible, a test of the soul itself, and he fears that many of his best men will never return. He knows that the Round Table, his life's work, will be broken by this quest. But the vow has been made. The quest for the Holy Grail has begun. What none of them understood in that moment was that the rules of this game were entirely different. A knight's worth was no longer measured by the strength of his arm, the number of tournaments he had won, or the enemies he had vanquished. All of that was meaningless now. The Grail was a mirror for the soul, and it could only be approached by those who were pure of heart. This quest would not be won by the strongest, but by the most virtuous. And so the greatest knight in the world was destined to fail. Sir Lancelot du Lac. The name itself was a legend. Peerless in combat, chivalrous, the very model of knighthood. He was Arthur's champion, the man who had never known defeat. If anyone could succeed, surely it would be him. But Lancelot carried a secret, a spiritual poison that made him unworthy. His adulterous love for Arthur's wife, Queen Guinevere. It was a sin born of love, yes, but it was a betrayal of his king, his friend, and his god. Lancelot's journey for the Grail is one of the great tragedies of literature. He rides out with all the confidence of a champion, but he finds himself humbled at every turn. He is defeated in justs by lesser knights, chastised in his dreams by angels, and forced to confront the ugliness of his own sin. He wanders for years, lost not in the woods, but in his own spiritual wilderness. He comes so close, so agonizingly close. In one vision, he reaches the chamber of the Grail. He sees it, but as he steps forward to approach it, a fiery breath blasts from the vessel, striking him down. He lies paralyzed, trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead for 24 days, a punishment for his presumption. He, the greatest of all knights, was permitted to see the mystery, but never to achieve it. His worldly glory was a barrier to his spiritual salvation. If the greatest knight failed, then who could possibly succeed? The answer came in the form of 3 men, each representing a different kind of spiritual strength. First, there was Sir Percival, raised in isolation in the forests of Wales by a mother who desperately tried to shield him from the violence and vanity of knighthood. Percival was a figure of pure innocence. He was a holy fool. When he first arrived at Camelot, he was so naive he didn't even know his own name. He was rough, uncultured, and lacked the polished chivalry of the other knights. But what he had was a simple, unshakable faith. He didn't understand the complex politics of the court or the subtle temptations of the world. He only understood right and wrong, good and evil. His quest was a series of trials designed to test that innocence. He is tempted by demonic entities disguised as beautiful damsels, tricked into fighting his friends, and nearly driven to despair. But through it all, his simple, honest heart guides him. He learns to see beyond the world of appearances, to trust in a power greater than himself. Percival's strength wasn't in his sword arm. It was in his humility. He represents the soul that comes to God not through knowledge or power, but through pure, untainted devotion. Then there was Sir Bors. Bors was different. He was not a perfect man, nor was he a naive innocent. He was a good, loyal, and steadfast knight who had a family. He was, in many ways, the most human of the Grail heroes. He represents earthly duty and unwavering commitment. His great test comes when he is forced to make an impossible choice. He sees his brother being led away to be executed, and at the same time, he sees a young maiden being dragged away by an evil knight. He can only save one. A typical knight of romance would save the damsel, but Bors, after agonizing prayer, chooses to save his brother. The damsel turns out to be a demon in disguise, sent to trick him into abandoning his family loyalty. Later, he faces an even greater test. He is told he must abandon his faith or be cast from a tower with his beloved. He chooses faith. Bors succeeds where others fail not because he is sinless, but because when faced with a choice, he consistently chooses God, duty, and faith over personal desire or temptation. He is the rock, the survivor, the witness. But neither Percival's innocence nor Bors's steadfastness was enough on its own. The quest required a leader, a knight so pure, so perfect, that he seemed to be more angel than man. His coming had been prophesied for generations. He was the son of Lancelot, conceived through an enchantment, but he was free of his father's sins. His name was Galahad. His arrival at Camelot was an event of pure legend. He walked into the great hall, an unknown youth, and went straight to the round table. There one seat had always remained empty. It was called the Siege Perilous, the perilous seat. It was said that any man who sat in it unworthily would be instantly consumed by fire. Galahad sat down, and nothing happened. The inscription on the chair magically changed to read, "This is the seat of Galahad, the High Prince." Then he was led to a sword embedded in a stone floating in the river, an echo of Arthur's own legend. The inscription on it read, "Never shall man take me hence, but only he by whose side I ought to hang, and he shall be the best knight of the world." Knight after knight had tried and failed to draw it. Galahad drew it with ease. He was not just another knight. He was destiny made manifest. Galahad was different. He carried a white shield with a red cross, said to have been drawn with the blood of Joseph of Arimathea. He moved through the world almost like a ghost, his mind fixed only on the spiritual, his purpose absolute. He defeated all challengers not through rage or pride, but with a kind of serene divine power. He was the embodiment of grace. Where his father Lancelot represented the flawed, all too human potential of knighthood, Galahad represented its spiritual ideal. He was the one for whom the Grail had been waiting, and so the stage was set. The flawed champion Lancelot had been turned back. The pretenders and the unworthy had fallen away, lost in the wilderness of their own making. Now only three remained, brought together by fate and providence: Percival the innocent, Bors the steadfast, and Galahad the perfect. Their individual trials were over. Now they would journey together, toward the Grail's final hiding place, to the mystical castle of Corbinic, and to the very heart of the divine mystery itself. Their vessel, guided not by wind or rudder but by divine will, cut through waters that seemed to shimmer with an unseen light. The air grew still, charged with an impossible silence. The world of men, with its clatter of swords and its political intrigues, felt 1,000 lifetimes away. For Percival, Bors, and Galahad, there was only the boat, the water, and the growing sense of an imminent, reality-altering arrival. They were sailing off the edge of the known map, into a realm where faith was the only true geography, and then they saw it, rising from the mists, not built of common stone and mortar, but seemingly woven from moonlight and prayer. The castle of Corbinic. It was known by many names: the Castle of Wonders, the Adventurous Palace, the home of the maimed king. It didn't stand on the shore so much as it commanded it, a fortress of the spirit that defied the laws of the physical world. As their ship glided to a silent halt, a great bridge lowered without the groan of chains, and the portcullis rose without a sound. An invitation, an inevitability. They stepped onto the hallowed ground, three knights who had been stripped of ego, of fear, of all earthly desire. They were empty vessels ready to be filled. They walked through the gates into a courtyard where time itself seemed to have pooled and settled. The air hummed with a power so ancient it felt like the memory of creation itself. They were met not by guards, but by a procession of robed figures whose faces were serene, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment for centuries. They were led into the great hall. It was a cavernous space, yet it felt intimate, holy. At the far end, upon a litter, lay a man whose face was etched with an agony that was more than physical. This was King Pelles, the maimed king, the keeper of the Grail. For generations, he had suffered a wound that would not heal, a wound inflicted by a holy weapon he was unworthy to touch. His suffering was the land's suffering. His kingdom was a barren wasteland, mirroring the decay in his own body, waiting for a savior. His eyes, full of a pain that spanned centuries, found Galahad's, and for a moment, a flicker of hope broke through the despair. Then the true ceremony began. From a side chamber, a procession emerged that silenced every thought. First came a damsel holding a great silver candelabra, its light seeming to bend and warp the very air around it. Then a squire, bearing a spear whose tip dripped with a single, constant drop of crimson blood that vanished before it could touch the floor. This was the spear of Longinus, the very weapon that pierced the side of Christ on the cross. The sight of it sent a tremor of awe and terror through Bors and Percival. Galahad, however, watched with a calm, beatific focus. And then she appeared, a maiden robed in white, her face a mask of sublime grace. In her hands she carried it, the Holy Grail. It was not a grand golden chalice encrusted with jewels. It was something far more profound. It seemed to glow, not with a reflected light, but with a light that poured from within its very substance. It was a light that was also a sound, a celestial music that vibrated in the very marrow of their bones. The light filled the hall, and as it passed, the tables were suddenly miraculously laden with every kind of food and drink imaginable. The Grail was the source of all sustenance, all abundance, all life. But this was merely a prelude. As the Grail was placed upon a silver table, a figure appeared as if from thin air. An old man in the robes of a bishop, his face radiating an impossible age and wisdom. He announced himself as Joseph of Arimathea, the first guardian of the Grail, brought here across the centuries by the power of God for this final Mass. He began the sacrament, and the reality of the great hall began to dissolve. The stone walls became translucent, the world outside faded away, and the three knights found themselves in a place beyond space and time. As Joseph raised the Grail, a figure descended from the heavens, a man of light and sorrow whose hands and feet bore the marks of crucifixion. It was a vision of Christ himself, who spoke to them, not with a voice, but with a wave of pure understanding that flooded their souls. He explained the mystery they were witnessing. The Grail was the dish from which he ate the Last Supper. The spear was the instrument of his passion. This was not a reenactment. They were experiencing the sacred moment itself, the ultimate communion between the divine and the mortal. Christ himself administered the sacrament to the knights. For Bors and Percival, the experience was so overwhelming it brought them to their knees, weeping with a joy so intense it was almost unbearable. They had reached the absolute limit of what a mortal man, however worthy, could endure. But for Galahad it was different. He was not overwhelmed, he was complete. He looked upon the face of God and saw a reflection of the purity in his own soul. Christ then turned to him and said, "My soldier, my servant, you have seen what you have desired to see. You have achieved the quest. Now you must do what you have come to do." The vision faded, leaving the great hall humming with residual power. Galahad rose, his face shining with an otherworldly luminescence. He approached the spear of Longinus, took it in his hands, and let a drop of the sacred blood fall upon his finger. He then walked to the litter of the maimed king. For centuries Pels had waited, his agony a constant reminder of his failure. Galahad knelt, looked at him with infinite compassion, and anointed his wounds with the blood from the spear. Instantly, the color returned to the king's face. The lines of pain vanished. He sat up, whole and healed, the curse of generations broken in a single holy moment. A great sigh seemed to pass through the castle, and through the windows, they could see the impossible happening. Outside, the barren wasteland was beginning to bloom. Dead trees sprouted green leaves, dry riverbeds began to flow with clear water, and the very air seemed to sweeten. The healing of the king was the healing of the land. The quest in this world was complete. In the midst of the quiet celebration, Galahad was granted his final vision. He saw the ultimate nature of the Grail, a secret so profound it could not be held in the mortal world for long. He understood its journey, its past, and its future. He turned to his companions, his eyes seeing things they could not. He had achieved everything a knight could ever dream of, and had transcended the dream itself. And in that moment of perfect fulfillment he was given a choice. He prayed, asking that when he chose, God would take him from this world. The voice of Christ answered, telling him that his prayer was granted. But not yet. There was one final task. The Grail could no longer remain in the sinful kingdom of Logres. His time in Britain was over. The three of them, Galahad, Percival, and Bors, were now its sworn guardians. They were commanded to take the sacred cup and the holy spear, to carry them from Corbenic, and to journey to a distant spiritual city, a new Jerusalem on earth, the city of Ceres. Their quest for the Grail was over. Their quest with the Grail was just beginning. And so they sailed, aboard a vessel not of mortal construction, the mystical ship of Solomon, guided by faith rather than by wind and rudder. Galahad, the pure-hearted, Percival, the simple and true, and Bors, the loyal and earthly knight who had resisted temptation to remain worthy. With them, the two holiest relics in Christendom, the cup that held the blood of God, and the spear that had shed it. Their destination was not a place on any known map. Sarras was a city of the soul, a bridge between heaven and earth, said to lie far in the spiritual east, near the earthly paradise. For weeks they traveled, the Grail providing their daily sustenance, its light a constant beacon in the cabin, a silent promise of the divine. They were leaving the world of men behind, the world of broken vows, of worldly ambition, of Camelot's fading glory. They were sailing toward the source. As the shores of Britain receded into memory, so too did the concerns of their former lives. Their journey was a purification, a shedding of the last vestiges of their mortal selves in preparation for what was to come. Finally, through a shimmering haze they saw it. Sarras. It rose from the sea not like a city of stone and wood, but like one of solidified light. Its towers pierced the clouds, not with arrogance, but with a sense of serene belonging. The legends say it was the very city where the first Christians, fleeing persecution, had found refuge, the city where Joseph of Arimathea's son had first been consecrated a bishop. It was a place steeped in holy history, a sanctuary waiting to receive its most precious artifacts. As their ship docked, the people of Sarras gathered, drawn by an unspoken instinct. They were a people long accustomed to miracles, yet they stared in awe at the three knights who disembarked, bearing the radiant cup and the bleeding lance. The air itself seemed to thrum with a new energy, but not all were welcoming. The city was ruled by a king named Escurant, a man whose faith was not in Christ, but in the old pagan ways and, more importantly, in his own absolute power. He saw these three strangers, with their shining armor and their talk of a new king in heaven, as a threat. He saw the devotion they inspired in his people, and he was filled with a tyrant's fear. He summoned them to his court. He demanded to know who they were and the nature of the objects they carried. Galahad, his face filled with a light that was not of this world, spoke of Christ, of the Last Supper, and of the quest. He spoke of a kingdom of the Spirit, not of land and gold. To a man like Escurant this was madness, or worse, treason. He saw the Grail not as a holy relic, but as an object of sorcery, a tool to bewitch his subjects and usurp his throne. His heart hardened. He ordered his guards to seize the knights and their treasures. Galahad, Bors, and Percival offered no resistance. Their battle was not with swords and shields. They were thrown into a deep, lightless dungeon, and the Grail and spear were locked away. Escurant believed he had snuffed out the threat. He could not have been more wrong. For an entire year, the three knights remained in that prison. They were given no food, no water, no comfort. By any mortal measure, they should have wasted away in weeks. But they were not alone in the darkness. Every day the Holy Grail appeared before them, its divine light filling their cell, its presence providing all the nourishment their bodies and souls required. They feasted on the grace of God. Their imprisonment was not a punishment, but a final trial, a period of ultimate contemplation. In that year of darkness, they grew closer to the divine mysteries than any knight had ever been. They had sought the Grail across the world, and now in a dungeon the Grail had come to them, sustaining them in their hour of greatest need. Above ground, King Escurant's world was crumbling. His kingdom was racked with misfortune. His people grew restless, and the king himself was struck by a terrible, wasting sickness that no physician could cure. As he lay on his deathbed, consumed by fear and pain, he finally understood. The power he had imprisoned was not sorcery, but holiness, and in his arrogance, he had declared war on heaven itself. He sent for the three knights. Frail and trembling, he fell before them, begging for their forgiveness. And Bors, the most human of the three, the one who understood sin and redemption, assured him of God's mercy. The tyrant king died, his soul at the last moment finding peace. The city of Sarras was without a ruler. The people were lost, uncertain of their future. Then a voice echoed through the streets, a voice that seemed to come from the very sky above. It spoke with the power of thunder and the clarity of a bell. "Choose the youngest of the three knights," it commanded, "to be your king." And so the people, in joyous obedience, went to the prison and brought forth Galahad. They placed the crown of Sarras upon his head. The purest knight had become the Grail king. Galahad ruled for 1 year, a year of perfect peace and justice. He was not a king like Arthur or Escarant. He did not build castles or wage wars. He built a spiritual kingdom. His first and only decree was the construction of a glorious chapel, a place called the Spiritual Palace. In its center he placed a table of silver, and upon it he set the Holy Grail. For a year, he and the people of Sarras worshipped before it, living in its benevolent light. Then, on the anniversary of his coronation, as Galahad knelt in prayer before the altar, a vision appeared. It was Joseph of Arimathea himself, or a celestial being in his form, descending from heaven, surrounded by a legion of angels. He had returned to perform one final mass, to reveal the ultimate secret of the Grail. He turned to Galahad. "Come forth, servant of Jesus Christ," he said, "and thou shalt see that which thou hast much desired to see." Galahad trembled, not with fear, but with an ecstatic anticipation that his mortal body could barely contain. He approached the altar. The figure of Joseph beckoned him to look into the depths of the sacred cup, and Galahad looked. What did he see? The legends are clear on one point. It is impossible to say. He saw the ineffable, the unveiled face of God, the secret of creation, the confluence of all time and space into a single perfect, overwhelming moment of divine love. The texts say he saw that which no mortal tongue may describe, nor heart conceive. A blinding light filled the chapel. The sight was too much, too beautiful for a mortal soul to bear and remain bound to the earth. Galahad's body began to shake, his face a mask of sublime, unbearable joy. He turned to Percival and Bors, tears streaming down his face. "I see it," he whispered, "the wonder that is not of this world. Now, blessed Lord, I ask that you take me, for my quest is complete. I have seen." He knelt, made the sign of the cross, and commended his spirit to God. And as his friends watched in breathless awe, Galahad's soul departed from his body. They saw a great multitude of angels bear his spirit upward, through the roof of the chapel and into the heavens. Then a final miracle occurred. A hand, but attached to no body, descended from the sky. It reached down and took the Holy Grail. It took the spear of Longinus, and it carried them up, following Galahad's soul into the celestial kingdom. The relics that had driven the quests of a generation, the objects that had defined an age of chivalry and faith, were withdrawn from the world. They have not been seen on earth since. The quest was truly over. The Grail was gone. Percival, his heart broken but his spirit fulfilled, renounced the world and became a hermit, dying peacefully a year later. Only Bors, the steadfast, the flawed but faithful knight, was left. He buried his friend, and then, his duty done, he finally turned his back on the holy city of Sarras. He began the long, lonely journey back to a place that now seemed a lifetime away. Back to Camelot to tell the tale. To tell King Arthur and the shattered remnants of the Round Table what had become of the Holy Grail, and of the knights who had been worthy enough to find it. But for one man, Sir Bors, the journey was not over. It was a long, lonely road back from the edge of the world, a path paved with the ghosts of his companions. Imagine his ride. Every sunrise a reminder of the divine light he had witnessed. Every sunset, a shadow of the friends he had lost. He was the sole survivor, the designated witness. He didn't carry the Grail itself, but he carried something almost as heavy. Its story, the triumph and the tragedy of it, all resting on his shoulders. He rode through lands that no longer seemed enchanted, the magic having been drawn out of the world and up into the heavens with Galahad. The quest had begun with a thunderclap and a vision, with 150 of the world's greatest knights setting out in a blaze of glory. It ended with one man, his armor tarnished and his spirit heavy, riding home in silence. When he finally saw the spires of Camelot, it was not with the joy of a hero's return. It was with the solemn duty of a messenger. The kingdom he returned to was not the one he had left. Years had passed. The relentless pursuit of the Grail had bled the Round Table dry. Of the 150 who had sworn the oath, most were dead. They had fallen in justs, been slain by rival knights in enchanted forests, or simply vanished, lost to the bewildering spiritual tests of the quest. Camelot felt hollow. The great hall, once roaring with the fellowship of the world's finest chivalry, now echoed with the whispers of the few who remained. The seats at the great Round Table were mostly empty, each vacant chair a monument to a fallen hero. and at the head of it all sat King Arthur. He was older now, the lines on his face carved deeper not just by years, but by worry, by loss. The hope that had ignited the quest had long since cooled into a quiet, gnawing anxiety. He looked up as Sir Bors entered, caked in the dust of a dozen kingdoms, his eyes holding a wisdom that was both divine and deeply sorrowful. The court fell silent. This was it. The answer. The end of the story. Bors knelt before his king, and with the weight of a world on his tongue, he began to speak. He told them everything. He spoke of the trials, of the temptations that had claimed so many. He described Lancelot, his own cousin, the greatest knight the world had ever known, being struck down, denied the final vision because of the sin that clung to his soul, his love for Queen Guinevere. He recounted the simple faith of Sir Perceval, and the transcendent purity of Sir Galahad, a man who seemed more angel than human. He painted a picture of the Grail ship, sailing without oar or rudder, guided by faith alone to the shores of a mystical land. He spoke of the maimed king, who had suffered for centuries with a wound that would not heal, a symbol of a land laid to waste. And then he told them of the moment, the climax of all their striving. He described the chamber where Galahad, Perceval, and he had finally knelt before the Grail. He spoke of a figure appearing, identifying himself as Joseph of Arimathea's son, and of the Grail being held aloft, no longer a simple cup, but a thing of pure spirit, of blinding, beautiful, unbearable light. He told them how Galahad, the pure knight, had performed the final miracle, how he had taken the sacred blood from the spear that pierced Christ's side and anointed the maimed king, healing the wound that no mortal medicine could touch. In that moment, the wasteland was restored. The curse was broken. The quest was achieved. A gasp went through the court. This was it, the ultimate victory. But Bors was not finished. His voice grew softer, filled with an awe that bordered on grief. He explained that after the miracle, Galahad knew his time on earth was done. He had seen the ultimate spiritual reality, and the mortal world was now just a shadow to him. He prayed for his release. Bors described, with tears in his eyes, how he and Perceval watched as a host of angels descended, how they lifted Galahad's soul from his body, and how they carried him and the Holy Grail and the sacred spear up into the heavens. The Grail was not one in the way they had imagined. It wasn't an artifact to be brought back and placed on a mantle in Camelot. It was a path to God, and Galahad had walked it to its very end. The Holy Grail had been withdrawn from the world of men. It would never be seen again in the kingdom of Logres. After delivering his message, Perceval too forsook the world, retiring to a hermitage to live out his days in prayer, dying only a year later. And so Bors, the most humble of the three, the one who saw himself only as a witness, was the only one left to return, to tell the tale. The great hall was utterly silent. There was no cheering. There was no celebration. There was only a profound sense of awe, and an even more profound sense of loss. They had succeeded. The ultimate quest was complete. But the cost was Camelot itself. The quest had been the Round Table's crowning glory, and its death sentence. It had scattered its knights, drained its purpose. With the Grail gone, what was left to strive for? The unifying dream that had built the greatest fellowship in history was now over. And in the vacuum it left behind, the old human poisons began to seep back in. The jealousies, the rivalries, the forbidden love between Lancelot and Guinevere that had been temporarily forgotten, now returned with a vengeance. The holy war was over, and the civil war was about to begin. The search for the cup of Christ had ended, and it had paved the way for the fall of the greatest kingdom the world had ever known. The Arthurian legend, the high romance, tells us the Grail left the earth. It ascended to heaven, beyond the reach of mortals, a spiritual prize for a spiritual victor. But that's not the only story. It's the most famous, yes. But another parallel legend persisted, a story that was less about spiritual perfection and more about a sacred bloodline and a secret history. This other story claims the Grail did not ascend to heaven. It claims that Joseph of Arimathea, or his descendants, carried the physical cup away from the Holy Land, westward to a safe haven. It wasn't taken up into the clouds. It was hidden, buried in the earth, protected by a secret society, passed down through generations, waiting for a time when the world would be ready for it again. This is where the myth splits, where the story of the Grail leaves the pages of romantic fiction and begins to haunt the pages of our own history. One path leads to a spiritual end, the Grail vanishing into the divine mystery. The other path leads to a tangible object, a cup made of wood or stone or silver, hidden somewhere in the misty hills of Britain, or the fortress monasteries of Spain, or beneath a church in Italy. The Knights of the Round Table sought a vision. But for the next 2,000 years, a new kind of seeker would emerge. Not knights, but historians, archaeologists, mystics, and conspiracists. They weren't looking for a spiritual metaphor. They were looking for a real physical cup. They were looking for the true hiding place of the Holy Grail. And their search would lead them to an ancient abbey in England, a place already steeped in myth and legend, a place some call the holiest earth in all of Britain, Glastonbury, the final resting place of King Arthur himself, and according to this other legend, the first secret home of the Cup of Christ. The story is as old as Christianity in Britain itself, a tale whispered on the wind across the Somerset levels. It begins not with a king, but with a quiet disciple, a man who dared to ask for the body of Christ, Joseph of Arimathea. According to the legend, after the crucifixion, Joseph didn't just fade into the biblical footnotes. He embarked on an epic journey, guided by divine providence, carrying with him the most precious relics in all of creation. Not just the cup from the Last Supper, but two small vessels or cruets, one containing the sacred blood of Jesus, the other his sweat, wiped from his brow on the cross. His destination? The farthest, mist-shrouded edge of the known world, the island of Britain. He and his followers sailed across the sea, navigating up the rivers until they reached a peculiar, conical hill rising from a watery marshland. The Isle of Avalon, what we now call Glastonbury, Tor. Weary from his travels, Joseph climbed the hill and thrust his staff into the ground. And in that moment a miracle occurred. The dry wooden staff took root, budded and blossomed. It became the Glastonbury thorn, a unique tree that, to this day, flowers twice a year, once in the spring and once at Christmas, a defiant bloom in the dead of winter, a symbol of life everlasting. This living miracle became the anchor for the entire legend. It was physical proof, something people could see and touch. It said Joseph was here. This holy ground was chosen. And according to the tale, Joseph then took his other treasures, the cup and the two cruets, and buried them deep within the hill, near a natural spring. He founded the first Christian church in Britain on that spot, a simple wattle and daub structure, consecrating Glastonbury as the cradle of English Christianity. And the spring? It became known as the Chalice Well. For centuries, pilgrims have flocked to its side, to drink from the waters that flow from the foot of the Tor. The water runs with a distinct reddish tint, staining the stones of its channel a deep rusty red. For the faithful, the explanation is simple and miraculous. The water is red because it flows over the buried Grail itself, forever imbued with the blood of Christ. It is a source of healing, of spiritual renewal. Geologists, of course, will tell you the color comes from high concentrations of iron oxide in the local sandstone. But where science sees iron deposits, legend sees the blood of the Savior. It's a place where two worlds collide, where faith and geology offer competing explanations for the same sacred mystery. For 1,000 years, this story simmered in the local folklore of Somerset. Powerful but regional legend. But in the 12th century, something happened that would catapult Glastonbury and its connection to the Grail onto the world stage. It all started with a fire. In 1184, a catastrophic fire destroyed the great Glastonbury Abbey, the church that stood on the site of Joseph's original chapel. The monks were devastated. They had lost everything, and they needed a way to fund a massive rebuilding project. They needed pilgrims, and pilgrims need a reason to come. It was then that the monks made a truly astonishing announcement. They claimed to have discovered, buried deep in their cemetery, the remains of none other than King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. The discovery was incredibly convenient. Gerald of Wales, a contemporary chronicler, described the excavation. He wrote that the monks dug down and found a massive oak coffin, and inside, the skeletons of a huge man and a woman with beautiful golden hair. A lead cross was supposedly found with them, bearing the inscription in Latin. Here lies interred the famous King Arthur, with Guinevere his second wife, in the Isle of Avalon. Suddenly, Glastonbury wasn't just the home of the first Christian church in Britain. It was now Avalon itself, the final resting place of the legendary king. Pilgrims and their money began to flood in. The abbey was rebuilt, grander than ever before. But think about the timing. This is the exact moment in history when the Grail romances are exploding across Europe. Chrétien de Troyes has just written his story about Perceval. Robert de Boron is writing his poems, explicitly linking Joseph of Arimathea to the Grail and to Arthur's knights. The monks of Glastonbury, who were highly educated and well-connected, would have been keenly aware of this new literary craze. They were sitting on a goldmine of myth. They had the supposed body of the king whose knights were famous for questing for the Holy Grail. It was the perfect marketing synergy. By linking their ancient local legend of Joseph of Arimathea with the newly fashionable international legend of King Arthur and the Grail, they created an irresistible destination. They effectively declared, "You've read the stories? Well, the story ends here. The quest is over. Arthur is buried here, and the Grail he sought is hidden in that hill right over there." Was it a pious fraud? A cynical ploy to raise funds? Or did the monks genuinely believe they had found their long-lost king? We will never know for sure. But the result was undeniable. Glastonbury became inextricably linked with the Grail. It was no longer just a cup. It was an English treasure, hidden in the English soil, guarded by the spirit of England's greatest king. This version of the story was powerful. It was tangible. You could visit Arthur's grave. You could drink from the chalice well. You could see a descendant of the holy thorn bloom in the snow. But as the centuries passed, the legend began to fray. The abbey was destroyed again, this time by King Henry VIII during the Reformation. The tomb of Arthur was lost. The original holy thorn was cut down by Puritans who saw it as a relic of Catholic superstition. The Glastonbury story, while still beloved, began to feel more like folklore than a hidden historical truth. The idea of the Grail simply being buried in a hill began to seem too simple, too static. The Grail as an idea is not static. It is a thing of questing, of secrets, of hidden knowledge passed through generations. The story needed more than a location. It needed guardians. It needed an organization with the power, the secrecy, and the sacred purpose to protect such an artifact through the ages. A brotherhood of warrior monks, sworn to defend the holy places and their secrets with their lives. As the romance of Glastonbury faded into a softer, more mystical legend, a new harder-edged theory began to take shape. A theory centered not on a sleepy English town, but on a global military powerhouse. A theory that the Grail wasn't buried and forgotten, but was found, seized, and spirited away by the most formidable and mysterious order of the Middle Ages. An order that rose from nothing to command immense wealth and power, that answered only to the Pope, and whose secrets were said to be darker and deeper than any kingdom's. The story of the Grail was about to leave the mists of Avalon and enter the world of shadows, of international intrigue, and of the Knights Templar, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. It doesn't sound like the name of a global superpower, does it? It sounds like a humble monastic order, and in 1119 that's exactly what they were. A small band of 9 knights, led by a French nobleman named Hugues de Payens, who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their stated mission was simple, noble even, to protect Christian pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads to Jerusalem. For 9 long years, that's all they were. 9 knights living in a wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, the very ground where Solomon's temple once stood. They accepted no new recruits. They seemed to do very little fighting. For 9 years, the historical record is strangely quiet. But what were they really doing for those 9 years? Were they truly just 9 men guarding roads? Or was that a cover story for the greatest treasure hunt in human history? The theory that has captivated historians and conspiracy theorists for centuries is that these 9 knights were not guarding pilgrims. They were digging. They were tunneling deep into the bedrock of the Temple Mount, systematically excavating the ruins of the first temple, searching for something that had been lost for over 1,000 years. They were looking for the legendary treasure of the Temple of Solomon, relics of unimaginable power, the Ark of the Covenant, and according to some, the cup that had caught the blood of Christ. Think about it. The one place on earth where a relic from the Last Supper might have been kept safe was in the heart of the early Christian church in Jerusalem. When the Romans sacked the city in 70 AD, what happened to its most sacred treasures? Were they destroyed, carried off to Rome, or were they hidden, secreted away in subterranean vaults, waiting for the faithful to one day return and unearth them? The Templars, with their unprecedented access to the Temple Mount, were in the perfect position to find out. After those 9 years of silence, something changed. Dramatically, in 1128, Hugues de Payens traveled back to Europe. He wasn't treated like the leader of a minor order of 9 men. He was treated like a king. At the Council of Troyes, the Knights Templar were officially sanctioned by the Pope himself. They were showered with donations of money, land, and castles. Young noblemen flocked to join their ranks. In the span of a few short years, they went from 9 obscure knights to the most powerful and wealthy organization in the Christendom, a multinational corporation with the soul of a holy order and the fist of an army. How did this happen? Did they simply benefit from good PR? Or did they find something in those tunnels beneath Jerusalem? Something that gave them leverage over the kings and popes of Europe? Their wealth became legendary. They invented the modern banking system. A pilgrim could deposit money at a Templar preceptory in London and receive a coded letter of credit, which they could then cash in Jerusalem, eliminating the need to carry gold along dangerous roads. They owned a massive fleet of ships. They owned property in every country in Europe. They were accountable to no king, no bishop, only to the Pope. They were a state within a state, a secret network whose influence was everywhere. And at the heart of this empire of faith and finance, the whispers began to grow. Whispers linking them to the ultimate relic, the Holy Grail. Suddenly, the Grail romances, the stories of King Arthur and his knights, started appearing in Europe, written by poets with connections to Templar patrons. Was this a coincidence? Or were these stories a form of code? A way of talking about the Templars' greatest secret in plain sight? Take Wolfram von Eschenbach's epic poem Parzival. It's one of the most detailed Grail stories ever written. But in his version, the Grail isn't a cup. It's a stone of immense power that fell from heaven. And who guards this Grail? Not Arthur's knights. Eschenbach is explicit. He says the Grail is guarded at the castle of Munselvesh by a chaste brotherhood of knights called the Templisen, the Templars. He practically spells it out. He even claims he got the story from a mysterious man in Spain who had read it from an Arabic manuscript, hinting at a secret history, a knowledge passed down not through Rome, but through the esoteric traditions of the Middle East, traditions the Templars would have encountered in Jerusalem. Could it be that the Arthurian legends were a brilliant piece of propaganda, a way for the Templars to embed the story of their sacred trust into the very culture of Europe? The quest for the Grail became a metaphor for the spiritual journey of a Templar knight, a journey of purity, sacrifice, and the protection of a holy secret. The Grail, whether it was a cup, a stone, or even a secret bloodline, became the symbol of their hidden knowledge and the ultimate source of their power. They weren't just bankers and soldiers, they were the guardians of a mystery that connected them directly to the age of Christ. For nearly 200 years, their power was absolute. They were untouchable. But when you build an empire that high, the fall is a long one. And it is always brutal. The Templars had made enemies. Powerful enemies. None more so than King Philip IV of France. Known as Philip the Fair, he was handsome, pious, and utterly ruthless. He was also deeply catastrophically in debt to the Templars. He saw their wealth, their secrecy, their private army, their allegiance only to a distant pope, and he saw not a holy order but a threat. A state within his state that he could not control, and a bank he desperately wanted to rob. He couldn't just attack them. They were heroes of the Crusades sanctioned by the Church. So he devised a plan of breathtaking evil and efficiency. For years, his spies infiltrated the order, gathering rumors, twisting rituals, and fabricating confessions. He prepared a campaign of disinformation, accusing the Templars of the most shocking heresies imaginable. That they denied Christ during their secret initiation ceremonies, that they spat on the cross, that they worshipped a demonic idol, a mysterious bearded head known as Baphomet. Then he sprung his trap. Using a secret order sealed until a specific date, he coordinated a massive kingdom-wide operation. At dawn on Friday, October 13, 1307, the date that would forever be associated with bad luck, the king's men stormed every Templar castle, farm, and preceptory in France. Knights were dragged from their beds, arrested, and thrown into dungeons. The Grand Master Jacques de Molay was captured in Paris. Philip believed he had cut the head off the serpent. He believed the legendary Templar treasure, a hoard of gold and silver beyond the dreams of any king, was finally his. His men smashed down the doors to the Templar treasury in Paris, their main headquarters. They ripped up the floorboards and tore down the walls. and they found nothing. It was empty. The vast, unimaginable wealth of the Knights Templar was gone. At the same time, reports flooded in from the port of La Rochelle, the Templars' main naval base on the Atlantic coast. The entire Templar fleet, a flotilla of ships laden with unknown cargo, had weighed anchor during the night and sailed out into the Atlantic, vanishing without a trace. In one single, coordinated night of terror, the Knights Templar were shattered, but their secrets, their treasure, and their most sacred relic had slipped through the king's fingers. The Grail, which had been hidden in the tunnels beneath Jerusalem, guarded in secret castles, and coded into the legends of knights, was once again lost to the world, spirited away in the dead of night. The question that has haunted treasure hunters and historians ever since is not if it escaped, but where did it go? The trail from Montségur went cold almost immediately, for Cathar Perfecti, carrying a treasure so immense it defied value, simply vanished into the Pyrenees Mountains. But a secret doesn't stay buried forever. It leaves echoes. Whispers of a sacred cup, passed down through a hidden lineage of guardians, began to surface in the esoteric circles of Europe. The legend mutated, taking on new life, waiting for a new kind of knight to take up the quest. And in the 20th century, a knight of a very different and far darker order would arrive. His name was Otto Rahn, a German medievalist, writer, and ultimately, an officer in the SS. Rahn was utterly obsessed with the Holy Grail, but he saw it not as a Christian relic, but as a pagan artifact of immense power, the cornerstone of a lost, pure religion. His obsession caught the eye of the one man in Germany who shared his fanatical belief in mystical objects: Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust. Himmler poured the vast resources of the Nazi state into the quest. He believed that possessing the Grail would grant the Third Reich invincibility, a divine right to rule for 1,000 years. He converted the colossal Wielsburg Castle into a Camelot for the SS, a place where his own twisted version of a knightly order would venerate the Grail once it was found. And he sent Otto Rahn back to the ruins of Montségur, not as a historian but as a Grail hunter, armed with a state-sponsored shovel. Rahn dug through the caves and catacombs of the Pyrenees, convinced the Cathars had hidden the Grail in a vast, underground network. He found inscriptions, he followed leads, but the cup itself remained elusive. The deeper he fell into the Nazi machine, the more his romantic quest became a nightmare. He was a scholar trapped in a death cult. The Nazis wanted a weapon. Rahn wanted a spiritual truth. When he failed to produce a physical artifact, the regime's patience wore thin. In 1939, Otto Rahn's body was found frozen on a mountainside in the Alps, an apparent suicide. The most fervent Grail hunter of the modern age died without his prize, consumed by the very quest that gave his life meaning. The Nazis never found the Grail. Their dark crusade failed. And perhaps that's because they were looking in the wrong country, chasing a phantom trail from a fallen fortress. While they were scouring the mountains of France, the strongest candidate for the Holy Grail was sitting, almost in plain sight, in a quiet chapel in Spain. Enter the Holy Chalice of Valencia. According to its own staggering legend, this is not just a cup, it is the cup. The story goes that St. Peter himself brought the chalice from Jerusalem to Rome. For over 200 years, it was used by the early popes to celebrate the Eucharist. Then in the 3rd century, facing the brutal persecution of Emperor Valerian, Pope Sixtus II entrusted the cup to his deacon, St. Lawrence, who smuggled it out of Rome and sent it to his homeland in Huesca, Spain for safekeeping. And there it remained, a closely guarded secret. It was hidden in monasteries, spirited away into the Pyrenees to protect it from Moorish invaders, the very same mountains where the Cathars would later make their last stand. It moved from one secret location to another for centuries, its journey a mirror of Spain's own turbulent history. Finally, in the 15th century, it was given to the Valencia Cathedral, where it has resided, with a few interruptions for wars and revolutions, ever since. For centuries, it was an object of local veneration. But is it real? In 1960, the cup was subjected to intense archaeological scrutiny. The findings were stunning. The relic is actually 2 parts. There's an ornate medieval base, added later to give it the grand appearance of a chalice. But the actual cup itself, the simple polished vessel at the top, is something else entirely. It's carved from a single piece of dark red agate, and scientific dating confirms that this agate cup was carved in the Middle East, somewhere between the 4th century BC and the 1st century AD. Let that sink in. The age, the material, the origin, it all fits. It is exactly the kind of simple, yet beautiful stone cup that a wealthy man like Joseph of Arimathea might have owned and used during a Passover Seder in Jerusalem in the 1st century. While there is no definitive proof, no DNA, no inscription that says property of Jesus Christ, no other relic on earth comes closer to fitting the historical and archaeological profile. The Catholic Church has never formally declared it to be the authentic Grail, but multiple popes have venerated it and used it in Mass, an implicit and powerful endorsement. Of course, it's not the only claimant. For years, the Antioch chalice, a plain silver cup held within an elaborate gilded shell, was thought to be the Grail. But modern scholarship has redated it to the 6th century, hundreds of years too late. In Genoa, Italy, a hexagonal green glass dish, once believed to be carved from a single massive emerald, was said to be the Grail. But when it was damaged during Napoleon's invasion, it was revealed to be just that, Byzantine glass. One by one, the other contenders have fallen away, leaving the humble agate cup in Valencia as the most plausible, the most historically sound candidate for the artifact that started it all. But what if the entire search, from the Knights Templar to the SS, has been based on a fundamental misunderstanding? What if the Grail is not a cup at all? This is where the story takes its most controversial, and perhaps its most profound turn. The clue lies in the name. In Old French, the Holy Grail was Saint Grail. Some researchers, most famously in the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, proposed a radical rereading. What if the words were not Saint Grail, but Sang Real, the royal blood? In this explosive theory, the Holy Grail was never an object. It was a person, a vessel not for Christ's blood, but of Christ's blood. The legend, they argue, is a coded story concealing a shocking secret: that Jesus Christ had a child, and that the Grail is the sacred bloodline that descends from that union. The cup, in this interpretation, is a symbol for the womb of Mary Magdalene, the carrier of the royal blood. Suddenly, the entire legend looks different. The quest of the knights wasn't to find a cup, but to protect a secret lineage. The guardians of the Grail weren't guarding a relic in a castle, they were the descendants themselves, hiding in plain sight. This theory suggests that this bloodline survived, intermarrying with European nobility, specifically the Merovingian kings of France, and continues to this day. It's a version of the story that transforms the Grail from a piece of archaeology into a living, breathing history, a secret hidden in our own DNA. It's an idea that has been dismissed by mainstream historians as pure speculation, yet it refuses to die, because it speaks to a deeper, more personal meaning of the Grail. And maybe that's the final answer. Maybe the true nature of the Holy Grail is that it is all of these things at once. It is a historical artifact, a simple agate cup sitting in a Spanish cathedral. It is a literary device, the heart of the greatest adventure story ever told. It is a conspiracy theory, a secret bloodline that could rewrite history. But most of all, it is a symbol. It's a symbol of a search for something that is missing in our own lives. A search for grace, for meaning, for a connection to something divine and pure in a broken world. The quest for the Grail is the human quest, written in the language of myth. It's the belief that there is a single object, a single answer, that can heal all wounds, restore the wasteland, and make us whole. For 2,000 years we have been searching. We've looked for it in the dust of Jerusalem, in the vaults of Constantinople, in the castles of the Templars and the caves of the Cathars. We've chased it through poetry and scripture, through ancient maps and modern conspiracies. But perhaps the final lesson of the Grail is that the quest itself is the point. The search for perfection, for truth, for God, is a journey that never truly ends. The Grail isn't just an object to be found, it's an ideal to be pursued. And its true location might not be in a distant chapel or a secret tomb, but in that quiet, hopeful, and unconquerable part of the human heart that dares to go looking for it.